Patreon. Did Jesus Exist series. We are Myth Vision. Did Jesus exist? Dr. Robert M. Price, the Testimonium Flavinium, but not only that. Let's deal with Josephus. How does a Christ myth, or someone who is skeptical of the historical Jesus and his existence, deal with the two passages in Josephus? Most know of one, but there are two. How do you deal with them?
Well, the biggie is the Testimonium Flavianum, because Josephus was attached to the household of the Flavian emperor, so no Jew would have been born with the name Flavius. So Flavius, and he was a military commander and a Pharisee. He was trained by a John the Baptist-like figure called Banus, who was an ascetic who lived down by the river and wore only clothing made of leaves. He didn't want to even wear linen because he didn't want to wear anything animal-derived. He was radically ascetical like the Essenes. And so Josephus eventually became a military commander during the war, the Jewish War, as I call it, the war with Rome from, I think it was 66 to 73 AD. And he was commander in Galilee, and apparently pretty effective, but eventually he saw the way the wind was blowing and the way everybody describes it, dumping on poor Joe, or as I like to call him, Flavius. They say, what a backstabbing coward that he turned a coat and became a chicken and went over to the Roman side. Well, yeah, that's possible, but that's what they were saying about Jeremiah, too, right? When he said, hey, forget it, the Babylonians are on their way with their hobnail boots, and you asked for it. Well, we don't think he was a coward, a traitor, or anything, so I'm not so sure Josephus was either. He just figured, well, the jig is up. Obviously, God is not giving us the victory, and it must be our fault. So he said, since God sent him, I might as well join with him, and maybe I can mitigate things. And so he did, and he rose high in the emperor's favor because Titus's father, right, Vespasian, was the general there, and they brought Josephus to him, and he said, I don't know where he got the idea, but he said to the general Vespasian, you know, there's a passage in the book of Numbers about a star symbolizing a great king and savior. Well, and that's one reason the Jews are making such a stink here, this messianic fever, but you are going to be the next emperor, and it's really predicting you. Whoa! I guess he fared pretty well, because Vespasian did become the next emperor, and he remembered Josephus, and so he gave him high honors and a place to live, and so on, and he used his leisure and wealth to write a few books, 4 I think, but 2 real biggies, the Antiquities of the Jews and the Wars of the Jews. And in both of them he was writing apparently for diaspora Jews to sort of remind them of their heritage. And it's interesting, he says in the Antiquities, where he summarizes a whole lot of the Old Testament and then fills in all kinds of fascinating information about the Maccabees and so on. He says, now, I'm just going to give it to you straight. I'm not going to add or subtract anything. And then when you read it and compare it, he's rewritten loads of stuff. But he thought he was just, he was rewriting it the way he remembered it, which is pretty interesting when you look at the Gospels that are supposed to be, like Luke's preface and so on. And he's also writing for the Romans, and he slants things a bit. He describes the major divisions of Judaism, the Pharisees, Sadducees, etc., the Essenes, as in terms of Hellenistic groups. The Pharisees are kind of like the Stoics. The Essenes are really Pythagoreans, and the Sadducees Epicureans. So he's slanting a little bit, but the comparisons are valid. And the thing he's really down on is messianism, and he mentions a whole bunch of would-be kings who fought against Rome. He says these guys are just troublemakers. They never learned their lesson. And he talks about Theudas the magician. He talks about Judas of Galilee, Menachem, and loads of these other guys. He says these bastards were the ones that got us into trouble, and why the temple is a set of ruins now. So he's trying to say, hey, don't associate me with that, and the rest of you should be over it too. Well, okay, a long way around. Does he mention Jesus in this history? Well, in our texts, he does, and you no doubt know the text goes something like, about this time there was a wise man called Jesus, if you can even call him a man, more than that. He was a teacher of those who love wisdom, and they received his teachings gladly. He got a bunch of followers both from the Jews and the Gentiles, and he did paradoxes, miracles, and eventually the chief men among us accused him before Pontius Pilate. He went to the cross and died, but those who loved him didn't give up on him, and said he appeared to them 3 days later. Accordingly, he was the Christ, of whom these and many other things were foretold, many other wonders, whatever. Wait a second, I thought this guy was a Jew. I thought he was against messianic pretenders, and he says Jesus was the Christ. What's going on here? Could Josephus have written this? Well, it used to be the most critical scholars would say, no, he didn't. Even Christian scholars say he couldn't have written this. It's obvious some Christian reading it, because Christians loved Josephus's works. Jews didn't. They thought this guy's a traitor. But Christians kept copying it, and it's a good thing they did. And so they figured, well, Christians were reading this, I can't wait to see what he says about Jesus. Nothing? Maybe he did. Well, look, I want a complete account of what happened, and Jesus is really the thing I'm most interested in. I'm going to pencil in some kind of a quick statement about Jesus. And no doubt, just as happened with the Bible, the next copyist said he thought it was part of the original and copied it as such. But it can't really have been, for these reasons I mentioned. And it's in recent studies have taken new approaches to this and shown, for one thing, that no one refers to this. Well, actually, this is old news. No Christian writer refers to this before Eusebius, the church historian in the 4th century. Why did nobody else, or plenty of earlier people, Irenaeus, Tertullian, loads of these guys, nobody mentions this? And loads of Christians were reading Josephus. And in fact, Origen, in the, I guess, early 3rd century, he's reading Josephus. And he says, well, one thing's for sure, Josephus didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. That kind of means he wasn't reading what we're reading. Was he reading something else, some earlier, more modest version? Well, that's what a lot of scholars think today, but I think that is just transparently silly. They're trying to make bad evidence into good evidence. They'll say, let's take the stuff that would suggest Josephus didn't write it and bracket those phrases, and what's left we can imagine a Jew saying. And so he did. That amazes me that you can get away with that. Talk about an ad hoc hypothesis. Well, so Origen wasn't reading what we're reading, and he differs in a couple of other places too. And we don't have any copies nearly as old as his. Though Vossius, a Dutch theologian, claimed a few centuries ago that he had seen a clean copy that lacked the Testimonium Flavianum, though we don't have that either. Another reason for dismissing the whole thing out of hand is the sentence structure of it. The Testimonium is nestled among about 3 or 4 other Pilate anecdotes showing what a Jew-hating bastard this guy was. And they're about him, so he is the subject of the sentences. Pilate did this. Pilate outraged the Jews by doing that. Pilate did this and that. But suddenly in this one, Pilate is mentioned only in subordinate clauses because this is about Jesus, not Pilate. Why would that be? I mean, even if he had mentioned Jesus as a martyr, he wouldn't have put it this way. Now, what about the vocabulary? Well, it does sound pretty much like the rest of Josephus, but it also sounds pretty much like the rest of Eusebius. And what do you know? Where does Eusebius quote this? It's in the midst of a polemical writing against pagans, I think it was, where he's answering criticisms against Jesus, the Christological character, the gospel character of Jesus, and if indeed it's proper to call him a man and various other things. In the context, he's addressing point by point these criticisms anti-Christians are making, and every bit of the testimonium sounds like an answer to one of those points, which implies Eusebius fabricated it. He wasn't above doing that. In another work of his, he says, it's permissible to lie for the sake of the truth. He probably did the same thing with the famous letters between Jesus and King Abgarus of Edessa. He said, I found these letters in the Edessan archives. No, you didn't. It's obvious they're Christian forgeries and probably Eusebian forgeries. Well, finally, the last nail in the coffin, somebody pointed out how what he says sounds like a kind of a paraphrase of mainly stuff from Luke chapter 24 that in more detail than I can get into here. But he says it looks like it's based on this, much as the long ending of Mark is based on Luke 24. And so it seems to me that, and there are other more traditional arguments against it, there is simply no reason to think that this was authentic Josephus. Now keep in mind, the text of Josephus suffered a good bit in copying. There was another Greek version. Josephus apparently updated these works. He wrote them in Aramaic and they were translated into Greek, and then he would do a new edition and so on. Well, one longer Greek version that survives only in the Slavonic translation, hence we call it the Slavonic Josephus, is longer and has all kinds of things in it, including a much longer Jesus story in which Jesus leads an armed uprising in Jerusalem. He's brought before Pilate at one point, and they let him go, but then he comes back, and this time he's crucified. It's fascinating. And some scholars think, yeah, this was written by Josephus, but most don't think so, and they think it's a patchwork of interpolations. But the point is that doesn't really matter. It all goes to show that Josephus's text is uncertain and continued to be added to and rewritten. But even if the whole thing were word for word by Josephus, he came along too late. He's born 30 years after Jesus supposedly would have died. He wouldn't have known anything but what Christians were saying at the time. So it all is a wash. I know some say that, well, there are a couple of Arabic quotations of this that are shorter and leave out some of the danger zone things, and one of them says he was perhaps the Messiah, and so on. But it seems to me that these are redactions of the testimonium as we have it in the Greek. It reads that way to me. For instance, if you cut out "he was the Christ," how come it still ends saying that the tribe of his followers extant today are named after him? Well, he wasn't called the Christ if these guys are right. You know, if they cut that out, then they're named after him. You mean they're Jesuits? No, they're Christians, but they've cut out the Christ thing. And this is amazing to me, because if you suggest as a mythicist that certain passages in the epistles were insertions, they say, oh, you just, that's an ad hoc hypothesis. You just find these passages like the Last Supper thing in 1 Corinthians 10 or wherever it is. You just find this embarrassing for your theory because it shows Paul did have some knowledge of the gospel story. Well, that's, so they're saying, you're saying what you have to say. It's an ad hoc hypothesis. Well, I tried to show this in my debate with Bart. Every one of those theories that these are Christian interpolations was made by a non-mythicist scholar, people that were just talking about the context and stuff. I don't know of a single one that was that mythicists proposed because it would get them out of a tight spot. It's just amazing to me. Now, what about the other? It's dealt with a little more quickly. He's talking about the shenanigans of the priestly leaders in the Sanhedrin while the interregnum between Roman procurators. One had retired, the other one was on his way but hadn't got there from Rome yet. Ananus, there's a bunch of priests named that, he wanted the priesthood, and the guy that was the new one was a man named James or Jacob, son of Damnius. And so what he did was to what Annas did was to have this guy falsely accused and executed. And other Sanhedrinists said, "What are you doing? You can't do this. This is not compatible with the Torah." And so they sent messengers, I think it was Albinus, to the new procurator while he was on his way, and said, "Get a load of this. You can't let this stand." He said, "You're right. That's outrageous." And so what the procurator did was to fire Ananus and say, well, how about James's brother, Jesus, son of Damnius, and he becomes the new high priest in his brother's place. Well, Richard Carrier pointed out that the only reason people think this had to do with Jesus or James the Just is that when it refers to James, it says the brother of Jesus called Christ. And that's and they say, oh, well, that's our buddy James from the Epistle of James and Acts 15 and all that. Carrier said no, he thinks that's a Christian interpolation trying to sneak James the Just into the text, but it doesn't even need to be that way. Priests were the anointed ones too. Kings were the anointed ones. So it may be that they're just referring to him as the one who was the new high priest until they killed him. So it's not that clear that Jesus or James are being the New Testament characters are being referred to. There could be, but you can't base the whole thing. Josephus mentioned Jesus, and he might have, but that's a very slim read. And so it just seems to me you cannot appeal to such an ambiguous, tentative thing for a number of reasons, tentative and unreliable, and settle the question like that. But apologists do because they're grabbing for anything they can.